All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Making the Modern Suburb. My name is Joanna Doherty, and I'm an architectural historian with the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission, and I will be moderating today's session, which includes presentations on two of Rhode Island's most distinctive post-war suburban developments, Governor Francis Farms in Warwick and Garden City in Cranston. In these two neighborhoods, we'll see many characteristics that are typical of mid-century suburbs, an emphasis on the automobile, for example, but also some things that make these subdivisions unusual. Our presenters are Melissa Andrade of the Public Archaeology Laboratory and Jennifer Robinson of Historic New England. Their bios are available on the conference website. A couple of quick announcements. We should have ample time for discussion after the two presentations. If you have questions for Melissa and Jen, please put those in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. If you have general comments to share with the entire group, presenters and audience members, please put those in the chat tab on the right side of your screen. Finally, if you scroll down, you'll see a section on this page titled Documents or something similar. There's a link there for a video about Garden City, which contains a lot of really great historic footage, so you might want to check that out at some point. And now I'd like to turn the session over to our first presenter, Melissa Andrade.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our panel. Just give me a second while my slides load. All right. So today I'd like to share with you a brief history of Governor Francis Farms in Warwick and highlight the architecture of the Campanelli brothers in the neighborhood. The community is part of a larger national narrative of suburban development that occurred in the mid-20th century, spurred on by the popularization of the automobile and a desire of middle-class families to live in single-family homes outside of yet close to major cities. Before I get into the details of Governor Francis Farms, I'd like to thank Liz Rochefort, whose research was crucial for this presentation. I'd also like to thank Henry Brown for sharing his personal collection of memories of the neighborhood with us. Governor Francis Farms is on land historically owned by the Brown family. The neighborhood is bound by Gaspee Point to the east, Warwick Avenue to the west, and coves and other residential development to the north and south. In 1782, John Brown of the well-known Brown merchant family acquired the property and named it Spring Green Farms. The farm was later inherited by John Brown Francis, John Brown's grandson and Rhode Island governor, and the property was passed down through the Brown and Francis family, with the southern portion of it remaining in the family's ownership to the present through Henry Brown. By 1928, the farm was owned by Alice Francis Brown and her husband, Frank Hale Brown. Alice was the adopted daughter and younger cousin of John Brown Francis's two daughters, Sally and Elizabeth Francis. Starting in the early 20th century, the family began to subdivide and sell off portions of the farm, strategically selling portions closest to Warwick Avenue, which was a major roadway and a connection to Providence. In 1931, the western portion, closest to Warwick Avenue, was subdivided and named Spring Green Acres. It consisted of a grid layout with 7,000 square foot parcels, which sold for a minimum of $175. The Browns oversaw all aspects of the development design, retaining ownership of the parcels until they were sold to the first owners. Alice Brown named the streets in the development, with north-south streets named after favorite flowers of Elizabeth and Sally Francis, including dahlia, and east-west streets named after family ancestors, including Shippen and Willing. This part of Governor Francis Farms was similar to other 1930s suburbs, with a grid layout, smaller lots, and Colonial Revival style houses. Spring Green Acres was marketed specifically to middle-class families, as you can see in this advertisement from 1931. The ad highlights safety of the development, easy access to a nearby elementary school, bus and trolley transportation to Providence, and access to Gaspee Point and its beach. An important element of this ad is where it notes that the community was reasonably restricted. The parcels were sold with deed restrictions, regulating construction and the land use to create a cohesive community of single-family houses, and these restrictions continued in the post-World War II phase of the development. Other advertisements state that lots were sold to selected people to protect investment of owners. This statement hints at restrictions of potential buyers based on race and religion. Majority of suburban neighborhoods developed in the early to mid-20th century in America had discriminatory sales practices in use based on race and religion. The practice was driven by governmental financial, and societal discriminatory practices and beliefs. Following World War II, these racial and religious restrictions in Governor Francis farms were upheld for some time through potential buyers being interviewed by the selling agent of the development, with Blacks and some European groups, such as the Portuguese, being denied. The first Jewish family was not approved to purchase property in the neighborhood until 1948, for example. It has been noted in some sources that the Brown and Francis family disagreed with these restrictions, although the selection of owners based on what was perceived as an acceptable group of people continued for some time in the neighborhood. Soon after Spring Green Acres opened, the Great Depression halted construction, and it did not resume until the mid to late 1930s. During this time, Alice and Frank Hale Brown's two sons, John Francis Brown and Francis Hale Brown, inherited the property and continued its development as a suburb, now named Governor Francis Farms. In 1937, they commissioned E.M. Prelwitz and J.D. Graham to design the remaining part of the land put aside for the development. Prelwitz and Graham both trained under Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. of the renowned Olmsted landscape design firm in Massachusetts. The Prelwitz and Graham design follows the rolling terrain of the landscape and purposely avoided a strict grid layout, instead using curving roads, semicircular drives, cul-de-sacs, traffic circles, and generous lot sizes to create a pleasing landscape design. This sketch map shows the curving roads, roundabouts, and less formulaic grid pattern of the neighborhood to the east of Spring Green Acres. Many of these design elements are based on Olmsted landscape design principles. The Browns hired civil engineer Frank Drew to plat the land on the Prelwitz and Graham design, and realtor and builder Roswell B. Liscombe was hired to sell lots and design houses. The Browns remained in control of the project as landholders and served as a board of directors for the development. The board of directors' approval was required for all building designs prior to construction beginning. Houses were constructed based on either Liscombe's designs or by architects who were hired specifically by individual lot owners. And most houses from the 1930s and early 1940s are Colonial Revival style, with a handful of modern and exotic houses scattered in the central portion of the neighborhood. And it's interesting to note that during this time period, flat roof houses specifically weren't allowed. In the early 1940s, a sale office consisting of two rooms in the Colonial Revival style and several Colonial Revival style model homes were constructed. The rear room of this office was for drafting and design, and the remainder of the building served as a model for different house options. Some houses constructed in the neighborhood were outright replicas of Colonial Revival houses, and others included elements that were influenced from the Georgian and Federal styles, including the house at 51 Westfield Road. This masonry house's massing and decorative elements are influenced by the Georgian style, and it was promoted in its sales listing as a fireproof house built of brick with a two-car garage and a modern kitchen. This is just one of the many interesting Colonial Revival style houses in the neighborhood, and by the onset of World War II, the development contained approximately 50 houses. During the war, though, construction faltered, and it did not pick back up until after the war years. Following the war and up until the early 1960s, construction boomed. The central and eastern portions of the neighborhood were developed in the space, and they contained mostly ranches in reserved mid-century modern or minimal traditional styles. Many of the ranches were designed and built by the Campanelli brothers of Massachusetts and other regional and local architects and builders. The eastern section of the neighborhood is more grid-like than the landscape-designed central portion, as can be seen in this aerial view. However, cross streets of the gridded-like area are varied lengths, and they have curved angles at intersections, which is tying the street design more into the central portion. Buildings are of matching setbacks, and the suburb is a uniform community of similar house types, yet they're all unique. Now for a brief overview of the Campanelli brothers, who were named the Gatsby builders when working on Governor Francis Farms, and they were described as designers and builders of semi-colonial ranches and as one of the largest building organizations in New England at the time. The Campanelli Brothers was a residential and suburban construction and development company established between 1946 and 1947 by four brothers, Michael, Alfred, Joseph, and Nicholas Campanelli. They were first-generation Italian Americans from Brockton, Massachusetts. Governor Francis Farms was their first project, and is one of the earliest instances of the widespread use of ranches in a Rhode Island suburb. The firm is significant in the design and technological advances of suburban houses in New England in the post-World War II decades, They were among the first to use concrete slab foundations and radiant heat in house construction, and they popularized the ranch house type in the area. By the end of the 1960s, the Campanelli brothers constructed over 30,000 single-family houses in 9 states, which were mostly ranches. Their houses throughout southern New England are fondly remembered by past owners and cherished by present owners as wonderful family homes, and many affectionately refer to them as campies. Campanelli brothers designed 6 types of houses for Governor Francis Farms and began construction in 1948. The houses were L and rectangular shaped ranches with a hip or gable roof, attached 1-car garage, and consisted of 3 bedrooms, a large living room with a fireplace, and a modern bathroom and kitchen. They incorporated bowed or picture windows and what has been referred to as a western window, which is a full-length multi-light metal sash window, which you can see in the house on the right-hand side of this advertisement. Campanelli houses also notably contained the hot water radiant heating systems in their foundation, which was state-of-the-art technology at the time. The color and pattern of many finishes in the house could be selected by the individual property owners, and the houses were sold with electric appliances installed, all of which were General Electric brand. All 6 house types contain unifying yet unique elements that create a well-designed and cohesive neighborhood. These house types remain apparent when driving around the neighborhood, and they can be easily identified. Many retain original character-defining elements such as cladding, fenestration, and reserved decorative elements, including shutters, doors, and trim elements. Alterations consist primarily of replacement cladding and windows, construction of additions, and conversions of garages to living spaces, as can be seen in some of the examples I'll show in a bit. The Campanellis constructed over 100 of these ranches in Governor Francis Farms alone, and they'll be discussed in detail next. The first of the 6 Campanelli ranches in Governor Francis Farms is the Algonquin. It consists of an L-shaped gable roof building with a brick veneer wall and vertical board cladding in the gable end and shingle siding on the remaining walls. A recessed porch shelters the main entrances, and the facade contains a picture window. A 1952 ad describes the house as an open floor plan that appeals to many of the younger set. Good-sized living room runs around the corner to formal dining, a fireplace, and a picture window included. Spacious master bedroom, 2 single bedrooms, and a tiled bath, priced at $14,750. The second house type is the Narragansett. It's a rectangular side gable roof building with a projecting central front gable bay that contains the main entrance and a paired window. The same 1952 ad states, although reasonable in price at $12,900, this home offers a lot of living in 6 comfortable rooms. 3 bedrooms, tile bath and shower, nice living room with a fireplace and bookcases, a dining room, kitchen, and a coffee corner. The Westfield is the third house type. It's an elongated L-shaped building with a hip roof. The entrance is at the wall junction of the L with a bowed bay window to the right and a garage at the far other end. There are paired windows in the projection with vertical board siding in the upper half of it. The 1952 ad states it has many unusual features for an active family and is priced at $15,690. The living room with a large Anderson bow casement window is a real honey. Fireplace, of course, dining room, and a wonderful kitchen. Part tiled with coffee corner for 4. 3 good-sized bedrooms, a master bedroom with a tile lavette for privacy, and a large tile bath is off the hall. The Sycamore is the fourth house type, and it consists of an L-shaped building with a side gable roof. It has a picture window overlooking the rear yard and a brick wall at the gable end, with a half-height sloping brick wall that extends from the house. And there's 2 entrances on the facade. The 1952 ad states, this unusual semi-colonial ranch home has a living room at the rear, which affords privacy and a picture window to overlook a future garden plot. It has a spacious kitchen with a formal breakfast room, 3 nice bedrooms, and a tiled bathroom, priced at $15,500. The fourth house type is the Nauset. It's an L-shaped building with a side gable roof that has an entrance at the wall junction of the L with a pictured and paired window at the far left and the garage at the far opposite end. It has mixed materials of horizontal and vertical cladding with both an open gable and pedimented gable on the ends. The 1952 ad describes it as a truly big home for a large family. The living room's at the rear for privacy, includes a fireplace and bookcase, and has a large formal dining room, 3 good-sized bedrooms, an attractive kitchen and coffee corner, and a porch, priced at $16,500. Lastly, the Warwick, so aptly named, is a rectangular building with a hip roof and a central entrance and a shallow projecting bay. It notably has one of the Campanelli's western windows and a garage. The 1952 ad states, "This attractive six-room home has many fine features. 3 bedrooms, tiled bath and shower, good-sized living room with a fireplace, bookcase, and picture window, and a dining room with a part-tiled kitchen and a coffee corner, priced at $14,500. By the early 1960s, construction in the neighborhood slowed since many of the lots were already sold or they were already built on. At this point, house styles began to shift out of the ranch type and more towards larger single-family homes, and many of them include larger split levels. By the early 1980s, the development contained over 1,000 houses. Even though its residential architecture is unique and interesting, Governor Francis Farms was also the first major development in Warwick that incorporated residential, commercial, and civic buildings in its design. A large, architecturally impressive shopping center was originally planned for the parcel bound by Warwick Avenue and Manicured and Namaquid Drives. However, the existing Governor Francis Farms Center was completed in its location in 1953 in a reserved Colonial Revival style. It notably included tenants such as Newport Creamery, which remains there today. In addition to the commercial center, the John Brown Francis Elementary School on Manicured Drive was constructed between 1951 and 1952 specifically for children in the neighborhood, and it served as a Warwick Public Elementary School until 2018. Few other suburbs in the state were designed in the mid-20th century to include these 3 building types: residential, commercial, and civic. In conclusion, Governor Francis Farms is an excellent example of a cohesive suburban development that includes residential, commercial, and civic buildings. The neighborhood is also unique for the role the Brown-Francis family played in its development and construction, serving as developers, board of directors, and overseers of the architectural design. Containing local and regionally notable architect and builder designed houses in styles ranging from the Colonial Revival style to mid-century modern, the development showcases the evolution of suburban architecture and shifts in the American lifestyle during the mid-20th century. Finally, the houses in the neighborhood are hallmarks of their styles, building technologies, and household amenity advancements in the mid-20th century. I hope you've enjoyed this brief history of Governor Francis Farms and learning about some of its unique builder-designed and construction houses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was really great.
Melissa.
So those are wonderful images and great information. Thanks so much. Jen is up next, and she is going to be sharing her presentation momentarily. And I think you're going to see some interesting parallels, but also differences, but some interesting parallels between Governor Francis Farms and Garden City.
Yeah.
And remember any.
No, I was just saying, give it a minute to upload here.
Yeah, that's great.
Yay. Can you see it now?
All right, take it away, Jen.
Awesome.
Looks great.
Great, thank you. All right. So as Joanna was saying, you are going to see some parallels here, certainly between Governor Francis Farms and Garden City, most notably perhaps the Newport Creamery. That was one of my favorite parallels. Somebody needs to do a thesis on that, I think, just Newport Creameries in general. But the one element about Garden City that's different, I think, is its inclusive commercial development, and that's what really set Garden City apart from its competitors during this period. This development promoted itself early on as a city within a city, and the idea of creating a conceptual, ready-made main street, complete with a pharmacy, a luncheonette, a salon, and a supermarket, along with specialty shops, a church, and a school, aligned Garden City with on-trend development that was happening around the U.S. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Joanna for her assistance with timelines and research, as well as the Kurz and Chippewa families, whose invaluable assistance really helped us to frame the history of Garden City with firsthand accounts. I'd also like to thank Janice Pascone, who helped with providing many of the images on behalf of Garden City Center. So stepping back in time for a moment, as we can see here in this aerial view taken in 1939, the area we know today as Garden City was purchased as 233 open acres by Nazareno Melicaro, who was a local developer. Before Garden City was built, its landscape was characterized by farmland. As you can see, it's sort of the white area toward the middle. It's interesting to note that a large portion was also occupied with coal and graphite mining, and the space was so open, anecdotally, that even small aircraft could land in the area. Now, fast forward to 1951, and we can see the extent of development. Garden City is sort of the triangular area toward the left. Why was Garden City first perceived as advantageous to development? Well, first of all, it was located close to transport links to Providence. Early literature promotes the area as only 4.5 miles from downtown. And second, it's sited directly adjacent to New London Ave, which is the big roadway that you can see running vertically on the left-hand side of this screen, which by the 1950s was being developed into a multi-lane highway. This connection to the automobile will be key to the way we view the development in subsequent slides. Now, Garden City was a project that received funding from the Land Planning Division of the Federal Housing Administration, and it was first conceptualized by Nazareno Melicaro, who was a first-generation Italian immigrant who had gained experience in the residential building sector as a contractor in the 20s and 30s. Melicaro went on to build several well-known developments, including Cranston's Oak Hill Terrace and Garden Hills. Melicaro was joined by a local engineer, Peter Chipola, who conceptualized the Garden City plat and was responsible for its survey drawings, one of which you can see here. And this pair was joined by architect Adolf Otto Kurz, a son of German immigrants who also had experience as a building inspector in Cranston. So it was really this trio that was responsible for the development as a whole. And according to Kurz's son Kenneth, who Joanna and I had the pleasure of interviewing, Mr. Melicaro sent Adolf Kurz to Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area, in 1947 or 1948 to study a housing development there. Kurz learned about construction techniques and site layout. And interestingly, there's a suburb in the Pittsburgh area also called Garden City. So perhaps there's a connection between this early reconnaissance mission and the neighborhood's name, because that's a question we get a lot. So let's take a look at some of the early development. One of the first buildings to be completed in the plat is this administration building, which played a key role early on in really building community. It not only served as business and architectural office space, but it hosted club meetings and community meetings, and even wedding receptions. According to Kenneth Kurz, part of its basement was intended as a bomb shelter, a real sign of the atomic age. Also part of the early development were these brick veneer apartment buildings, 7 in total, with 94 units, described in the Cranston Herald as, quote, miniature replicas of the large apartment houses found in New York City, end quote. As you can see, they were also built with a blend of modern and traditional styles, much like the rest of the development. The central bays have glazed bricks, corner picture windows to maximize light, but the entrances themselves have a Colonial Revival sort of historicist feel that is remarkably still intact. So a big part of the early years was obviously pitching the development to potential clients, and it seems like no one was a better salesperson than Melicaro himself. Here we see him with his daughter in the Cranston Herald pitching one of the neighborhood's taglines, a city within a city. Ken Kurz recalled that Melicaro could frequently be seen riding around Garden City in his car, leaning out the window and chatting with families walking around, constantly promoting the neighborhood and looking for buyers. In addition to designing houses in Garden City, Adolf Kurz supervised their construction and was involved with showing houses and selling property. So homes were built both on spec and built to order, depending on the client. So for example, some clients were able to specify different interior finishes like carpentry, cabinetry. And union labor was used in general construction. So specific crews would be called in to complete specific jobs, such as framing and tile work. In this advertisement, we see one of the most ubiquitous house forms in the Platte, the ranch. And this took many forms in Garden City. I've classified them into sort of three general types. But in this particular instance, it was being promoted by the Home Builders Association of Rhode Island's Good American Home Program. So interestingly, although houses throughout Garden City have been modified over time, they've remained largely intact in terms of size. Very few have sizable additions, which contributes to a sense of intactness as you're driving through the neighborhood. And in this slide, we see variations of the mid-size ranches that are perhaps the most common form that you see in the neighborhood. It should be noted that in initial deeds, there were covenants that delineated setbacks, specified house size, and restricted the construction of outbuildings, which furthered the sense of a unified community. And also, despite many similarities between house types, there's a variety here that breaks the uniformity of sort of Levitt-style developments, which was frequently being criticized at the time. So even simpler ranches are clustered around the southern edge of the development. So if you're familiar, sort of the Poplar Drive area, their similar design and date of construction suggests that they were built together on spec rather than custom. However, larger and more linear ranches are located in the northern section, and these incorporate the widest variety of materials and finishes, and of course have a large picture window, perhaps the most important feature of a post-war home. And of course, the most elaborate ranch in the Platte is the Melicaro residence, which is at the bottom of the screen, which incorporates a stone exterior and Colonial Revival flourishes such as a cupola and weather vane. Now, there are other important forms too that are scattered throughout. Cape Cods in some ways recall the Levitt capes that were built during this period, and this was a form that was also being promoted by the FHA. And of course, there are colonials with varying roofs, entrances, windows, and materials that are, again, continuing to reinforce sort of this traditional idiom. Now, this aerial view shows the extent of development by just 1953. From this vantage point, you can see the curvilinear street patterns that were laid out by Peter Chipola. This was a common FHA device to break up the monotony of grid-like streets, and certainly added to a picturesque effect in Garden City, where mandated setbacks brought landscaping to the forefront. Now, simultaneous to all this house design, an unknown architect was drawing up plans for a commercial center that would provide retail amenity to the neighborhood. In this early rendering, we can see the first stages of the development, the footprint of which is actually very similar today. Commercial development coinciding with residential development was a concept that was already being explored in pre-war America. On the West Coast in particular, development of shopping centers in the post-war period were reaching a crescendo in the 50s and 60s. And note that parking is central to this design. This was emphasized in almost all advertising literature around Garden City. All of the shops face inward away from New London Ave, which runs across the top of the screen. All the shops are facing toward one another, further emphasizing the idea of a commercial hub centered on the neighborhood rather than a particular street, as a strip mall would be. In essence, there's an attempt here to create a miniature Main Street. Now, in these advertisements, there's an emphasis on convenience, which is twofold. On the one hand, there's an implied idea that urban environments like Providence are crowded, outmoded, and lack parking. There's also an increased emphasis on catering to suburban shoppers, mainly women, who could obtain household commodities in one location. Different than what we see today in Garden City Center is an emphasis on local business and service retail. Of course, I had to include this ad introducing Newport Creamery, one of the few businesses still operating that has been in the same location since 1954. And it is interesting to look at the language used in advertising around Garden City to promote itself. Stores in particular promote things like self-service, air conditioning, speed, automatic doors, and checkouts, all attributes that were valued at mid-century when idealism around technology and modernity were at a peak. I think the tagline, "Designed for Real Living," says it all. The idea that better quality of life can be achieved through new construction and new commodities. Now, all of this new development and a boom in population put a strain on infrastructure, including the school system. For Garden City, this meant the construction of a school in 1952. And like many schools of this period, Garden City employed an international style in marked contrast with the traditional homes surrounding, with classrooms opening directly into a courtyard. This style was easy to add on to, and in fact, Garden City School did in 1956. In addition, the land used to build a Catholic church was donated by the Melicaros in 1952, and it operated as a so-called basement church until the 1990s, when the parish raised enough money to complete the church as it's seen today. Now, by 1962, the Garden City development was nearing its completion, about 700 houses. Sadly, Mr. Melicaro passed away in 1955, leaving the family business to his son, Robert. However, Robert oversaw the last phase of expansion of Garden City Shopping Center, which you can see taking place here. The graphite mine was still in place as of around 1962 when it was finally demolished during this last phase. So the last phases of later housing included fashionable split levels, which are seen here, as well as some more custom ranches and infill. And in this photograph at the upper left, we see then Governor John Chafee at a groundbreaking ceremony for this last phase of commercial development in 1962. We can also see glimpses of the other side of the shopping center, including Sweener's Candy, the only other local shop that's still in operation today. Now, the following architectural renderings are some of my favorites. They provide us with a glimpse of sort of idealized 1960s retail design. This is Kennedy's, a clothing retail store, currently the location of the Party Store, if you're familiar with Garden City. And this is Gladding's, which has been in the shopping center since its early days, but expanded in the early 1960s. And finally, the crown jewel of this second phase of development was, in fact, the Outlet Company, which opened in 1963. Like Gladding's, the Outlet represents a further shift to the suburbs from Providence's downtown core. These were both branch stores intended to supplement the anchor stores in Providence, but with added amenities such as car service, which you can see on the left-hand side. And interestingly, during recent renovations, the original concrete O cladding was briefly revealed under contemporary accretions. Now, there's so much more that I could say about Garden City's evolution and the ways in which it has both changed and remained the same. But I think Garden City's original ethos can be summed up in this excerpt, which was part of an advertisement welcoming Almax to the development in 1949. In it, the key words are fine homes, low cost, and convenience, as well as shopping that will all help to make everyday life the joy we want it to be. This sort of mission statement is no doubt idealistic and aspirational, but its central premise to combine both housing and a commercial center set apart Garden City in its early days. And the people behind its inception, I think it's most interesting to note, were all immigrants or the children of immigrants whose combined expertise shaped not only Cranston's built environment, but influenced Rhode Island's suburban landscape well into the 21st century. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That was terrific. So if you want to, I know you're working on unsharing your presentation, yes, and then we can have some Q&A. So if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like Melissa and Jen to discuss, please add them in the Q&A tab. I have a few questions, so maybe I'll kick things off with just kind of a general question for both of you. And this is beyond the scope of your presentations, but I'm wondering if you could address kind of the broader context in which these two neighborhoods developed. So, you know, in the mid-20th century, the city of Providence was really going through a decline. The population peaked in the 1940s. And, you know, at the same time, it seems to me that sort of the suburban development was kind of the flip side of that. And I'm wondering if you could talk at all about kind of the forces that helped kind of fuel the decline of Providence, but also fuel the development of places like Garden City and Governor Francis Farms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Melissa, do you want to go first?
Sure. So it's a lot of different things that were at play that were creating suburban development, not even just in Rhode Island, but across the country, and they are all interconnected. The biggest ones were the popularization of the automobile and the development of highways. It made transportation like record-breaking easy, whereas previously you didn't want to live far away from where you were working and where your life was based, because then you'd spend so much time commuting. But with the cars and how affordable they became, it became more of an achievable goal to live further outside of an urban area and commute there for work. And during the time period as well, there was also starting to be major housing shortages. So that's why suburbs are starting to be created, because there was a new desire for single family houses, specifically from the middle class, and a desire to like own your own property. And there was shortage of housing, so it was prime for developers and architects to start creating these types of homes, which was pulling people from the cities towards the suburbs. So Jen, do you want to add stuff to that?
Sure. I mean, I know that there was, you know, sort of a start of decline in industrial jobs in the city too. So I think that's an element at play. And all of these factors combining are, including the ones Melissa talked about, are reshaping Providence in terms of urban renewal projects, the highways that cut through Providence. And so there is definitely an idea of the urban environment, and this dates even back to Victorian times, the urban environment being dirty, it being outmoded, as I said, and definitely people fleeing this idea of headed toward a new place. And of course, that's often termed white flight because there's a racial element at play in terms of the dynamic created of people that were leaving the city to find homes elsewhere during this urban renewal period. So that, I think that's important to draw out as well.
Right, yeah. We do have a couple of questions now, so I'll turn to that. Liz asked if you think there's a case to be made for Garden City, Governor Francis Farms, and similar neighborhoods to be listed in the National Register. Do you think the individual elements in these neighborhoods have sufficient integrity for listing? So Jen, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I mean, I think they do. I mean, I think this is a discussion we're having across the board, right? In terms of, okay, maybe there's vinyl siding and there's different changed elements, but the essence of the development is still intact. And like I said in my presentation, when you drive through, there haven't been so many changes in terms of additions and modifications to the houses that you can't read the original development. I'm not sure if the same could be said about the commercial side. Although it is interesting, when I saw that cladding being pulled back, I'm like, there could be some interesting stuff just hiding underneath. So I think this is just a question that's coming up in general about mass housing projects. It's really the entity as a whole that's important rather than maybe the individual elements. It's the elements working in concert that make them unique or interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm more familiar with Garden City, and I know that the site plan is very intact. It's not like there's new roads that are interrupting the site plan that the engineer laid out. It still feels very mid-century to me. I'm less familiar with Governor Francis Farm, so I'm curious to hear what Melissa has to say about that as a potential National Register area.
Yeah, so doing all this research and driving around the neighborhood, I would definitely say that it's National Register eligible. It's a unique neighborhood based on the houses in it. It contains a lot of unique architecture, notable designed houses from pretty well-known architects as well as builders, and the integrity is there. Like you were saying with Garden City, the landscape's still intact, the street layout's still intact, it still has the core of its buildings. Yes, there's been alterations, but you also have to look at houses from this period a bit differently integrity-wise than you would older houses, because the materials on these houses to begin with were what we would consider normally negative replacement materials. Like these houses had asbestos siding, these houses had, vinyl materials, metal and vinyl windows. So are replacement materials of those same material really as negative as you would think in an older neighborhood, or does it not really impact the integrity because the core of what the building is and what it was designed for and what its original design was is still there? And especially for Governor Francis Farms, it's a little more unique as well because of the influence of the Brown Francis family. They owned all the land. They were the ones leading the charge with developing this neighborhood, selling the lots, having the restrictions over what was built there. And you can definitely see the care that was taken in forming a very well-designed neighborhood because of that. Whereas other neighborhoods, I know Jen mentioned Levittown, but like those were solely designed to make money and build houses. So it's like small lots, not unique houses. They were all very cookie cutter the same. And you just don't get that at Governor Francis Farms. It's really unique for that. And you can see the same for Garden City.
Right.
We have a question for you, Melissa. Elizabeth says, this seems silly, but I have noticed that Governor Francis has more weather vanes atop houses than I have seen anywhere else. Do we think that there's a reason for this? Have you noticed something similar, Melissa? Or?
I didn't notice that so much as some other elements, but it is interesting to think about. I imagine a lot of those are probably in like the Colonial Revival house areas of the neighborhood, which then would make sense because that is a common element you see in like Colonial Revival architecture and stuff like that. But that's interesting to note, they still have it, so good fact.
Yeah, and I think it ties in like thematically. I mean, it's Governor Francis Farms. It has this sort of historicist feeling already, and then so the weather vanes and all these kind of elements contribute to that effect, I think.
Yeah, I was struck by how in Governor Francis Farms the commercial development is very Colonial Revival, even though it came later when a lot of ranches and more modern houses were being built. But sort of the public face of the development, I guess, that more people would kind of interact with, has kind of faux chimneys and gabled dormers, and I think it's got some cupolas on it. So very interesting contrast.
Mm-hmm.
A question for you, Jen, from Elizabeth Francis. Do you have thoughts on the social welfare and penitentiary institutions being so close by to Garden City? the area and buildings that are now Chapel View. It is kind of a funny juxtaposition in some ways.
It is definitely a funny juxtaposition. And you look at those early aerials, Reservoir Ave is called Reservoir Ave because there was a giant reservoir up there as well, which no longer exists. It was right near the institutions. It is an odd juxtaposition, and one that has sort of just developed over time. I mean, there were rail links as well going through the neighborhood as late as even I can remember, like the 1980s. So there is a connection between the state institutions and the rest of Cranston, but I don't know about in terms of whether that was considered as in terms of a location for development or not, or if I think they were just purely interested in those, the links to New London Ave, Reservoir Ave, because it was easy access for cars and bus travel. I mean, they were still promoting it for people outside the neighborhood, commercial wise, to come and shop. I think that was their main goal. And I think those roads were kind of first built to connect the state institutions, along the way. So there is a connection there.
And the fact that sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just the fact that the graphite mine continued to operate while the shopping center was already in use. Funny.
We had that fabulous anecdote from Mr. Kurz that while he worked at Garden City as a teenager, that he would leave Newport Creamery at night on his shift and get blown with graphite dust. It was just hilarious. This close juxtaposition of industry and commercial. It was just kind of just go with the flow at that point. It seemed like. Yeah.
So we only have a couple minutes left, but we do have one more question from Devin King. Curious if this research reflects discussions within historic New England about contextualizing the histories of the properties historic New England stewards within these stories, sort of looking into how the presence of 18th and 19th century historic sites relate to these post-war subdivisions and vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's part of the broader context of some of the research we're doing within my team, Preservation Services. I know we own a lot of museum properties, and we're always looking at the context of where they're located. But also, we're doing a project right now on kit houses, which has just launched, which is going to have an interesting connection to post-war and pre-war development. So stay tuned for that. That's one thing that we're going to be taking a closer look at coming up in the next few years. So,
excellent. I think we are almost out of time, and there aren't any unanswered questions, so this is probably a good time to wrap up. Thank you very much, Melissa and Jen. These were really interesting presentations. I think gave everybody a new perspective on places that might be a little bit familiar to them, but they didn't know a whole lot about. So thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.